Hello, everybody. Sorry about the delay. Iki will record it this week. Thank you very much. Great for coming. Great to see you again this week. Hello, everybody.
Okay, delete the second.
Thank you so much for your generosity weekly. As usual, if you want to donate, the link will publish it in the chat, or you can do it through our website. And thank you, Geshe, so much for this teaching. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's yours.
Okay, thank you for that, Leora. Well, actually, I was going to start today in a slightly different way, which means, of course, we'll do the prayers and setting the motivation. But having done it so many times and doing it over and over the same way, there's danger it just becomes, an action of just going through the motions and not really reflecting on what we're doing. So I just want to stress the importance of setting the motivation, more in the context of understanding emptiness, because what I'm trying to bring into all this preparatory part, that's part of the meditation, setting the motivation and so forth, is three things that Lama Tsongkhapa recommends for the realization, the understanding, the realization of emptiness. So Lama Tsongkhapa says it's not enough to merely think about emptiness and reflect on it, analyze it, meditate on it. That in itself will not be sufficient. You need three other things. The first thing is to accumulate merit. The second is to purify negativities. And the third is to supplicate your Lama, your teacher. Now, accumulating merit, when we generate bodhicitta in the very beginning, do the four immeasurables, visualize all sentient beings, do the meditation, all this is part, of course, of generating or accumulating a lot of merit. And of course, if we can continue with that throughout the week, well, we've definitely done this part of the preparation. Likewise, if we apply the four powers, that is, in other words, if every now and then we think of whatever non-virtue we've accumulated, even if we can't remember all of the non-virtue, but we generate regret for whatever we've done, and then again generating bodhicitta in that context, well, it becomes the practice of purification. So now, where do you find purification? In the practice we do as part of the last prayer, the 7-limb prayer. It says that I confess all my negative actions, and I usually give you a break. I have explained it in the beginning, I believe. So you generate just sincere regret in that moment. Whatever I've done to harm others, I have regret, and I want to purify that. I want for that negativity to be purified. So that gives you the opportunity to bring in the four powers, the most important being regret. But then the third is supplicating one's Lama. Now, Lama here, of course, means someone very special, spiritual Lama, a highly realized being, if possible. Perceiving that person as a Buddha, not because they necessarily are a Buddha, may not be a Buddha, there may be a Bodhisattva, and not even a Bodhisattva, definitely having higher realizations than ourselves. But visualizing them to be a Bodhisattva or a Buddha helps us to connect with Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. There are lots of explanations how that works. Lama Zopa Rinpoche wrote a whole book on this, how this actually works. And anyway, it is seen as extremely important to have this connection with a certain Lama. And here, of course, to be on the safe side, a Lama like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, someone fully qualified. And it's not about meeting this person, communicating physically with this person. It's just a mental connection that we generate. And that mental connection, I want to bring forth in, visualizing Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the space in front of you, as we usually do, again, in the form of our own teacher, our own spiritual Lama or Lamas. if you have more than one Lama, and make that connection. And then, of course, as part of the 7 limb prayers, you do prostrations, you make offerings, request the Lama, or Buddhas and Bodhisattvas through the Lama to remain, and so forth. So to have all these aspects, accumulating merit, purifying negativities, and supplicating the Lama in the way of like supplicating as in like connecting to the Lama, possibly requesting the Lama, requesting the Lama for his or her assistance, and of course, accumulating merit in connection to the Lama. Okay, so in that way, it's said to be extremely powerful to do these three. If these 3 are given and you meditate on emptiness, well, then you're much more likely to gain realization. So it's like if you want to bake a cake, if one of the ingredients is missing, the resultant cake won't be that which you're looking for. So in that way, these 3 are extremely important. And the problem is if we do this over and over again, something gets lost. So when I'm here in Germany, I've been in Germany for a while now, I overhear people talking about a relationship running dry or people drifting apart. And then this kind of idea of bringing in more spice. I hear this over and over again. And what does it mean to bring in more spice? To bring in more emotion. So like the first time people met, bring in that kind of emotion. So that reminded me of how our practice should be. When we initially did this practice, we had this spice. There was some mental spice in the sense there was some interest. We liked to do it. There was enthusiasm. We did it really well. We gave our very best. And now it's like we go through the motions, possibly. So we need to bring in more emotions as if we did this for the first time. So when I find myself doing a practice over and over again, personally, of course, I watch my own mind. I observe my own mind. If I do observe my own mind, I notice that I'm just going through the motions. So sometimes I try to do my visualizations. If I prostrate to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, I do it differently, not in the usual way. Possibly I visualize that I multiply it thousands of times and I prostrate towards Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Or I do these really extensive kind of prostrations. I visualize it just in a different way, in a new way. So there's a different emotional state of mind that brings the whole thing more alive. I've also talked about this beginner's mind. It's like a beginner's mind. Every time it should be like you do it for the first time with that concentration and enthusiasm. So let's try this together again as part of this preparation to accumulate the 3 causes that are needed, as Lama Tsongkhapa recommends, or as he instructs, that we should generate in order to realize emptiness. Okay. So let's start as usual with some breathing meditation, just to calm the mind and become more focused. And then visualize in the space in front of you Buddha Shakyamuni, who appears in the form of a fully ordained monk. an emanation of the enlightened mind. Free from any limitation, any obstruction. And inseparable from your Lama. And then surrounding the Buddha, the great masters of India. The Nalanda tradition, such as Nagarjuna, Chandakirti, and all other great Nalanda masters. And likewise the masters of the Pali tradition. But not just from India, but also from other Buddhist countries, Tibet, and so forth. Just visualize those in the space in front of you as inseparable from your personal Lama. And even if you can't see them clearly, try to feel their presence. And then surrounding the front visualization, surrounding you are all sentient beings. Quietly filling the space around you. The horizon is filled with endless sentient beings. All of them in a past life, having at some point been really close to you. And right now experiencing endless forms of anxiety, fear, depression, sadness, and so forth. Physical illness, mental diseases, and so forth. Having no control over what's happening to them from moment to moment. And so based on the understanding that they're just like ourselves and that they just want to be happy, don't want to suffer, and that at some point they were extremely close to us in a past existence that we just don't remember. Generate affectionate love. That is a feeling of closeness and acceptance, each and every one of those beings. Finding each one of them endearing, lovable, and worth of our affection. Worthy of our affection. And then based on our understanding of the fact that they're all suffering, at the very least, having a body and mind that is in the nature of suffering, let's generate great compassion. Thinking, may they all be free from suffering and its causes. And may I be able to protect them from whatever is in their way to attaining liberation. And as this wish, this aspiration grows stronger, it transforms into the special altruistic attitude. That is the determination to do whatever I can to liberate or lead sentient beings to a state of liberation, free from suffering and its causes. And that then gives way to the mind of enlightenment, the determination, I will become enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. And it is with this goal that I will listen today and reflect and meditate on Chandrakirti's entry into the middle way. So let's start with refuge and deepening bodhicitta, prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then focusing on the front visualization. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. All right, great. So having done that, just to stress this again, what I just said, it's seen as extremely important to bring in emotions, bring in certain emotions. So when we hear the word emotion in the Buddhist context, oftentimes we think, oh, emotions are not good, as in like, well, Buddhism talks about negative emotions, harmful emotions. But of course, as the way I just formulated it, we're talking about negative, harmful emotions that we need to get rid of. But positive emotions such as love and compassion, of course, are emotions we like to foster, we need to strengthen. But in terms of meditation, when we talk about emotion, it's really difficult to pinpoint what emotion is meant. But something that moves you from deep within. So any meditation you do, in particular with regard to emptiness. So It's none of the emotions, none of the negative, of course, but it's also not love and compassion we're talking about, but some inner kind of enthusiasm or an inner well, force, if you like. It's hard to say, like a joy from deep within, or like being moved by what you've just meditated on. So it shouldn't just be this kind of flat way of just thinking about things and not being moved in any way. That would not be effective enough. So I remember Geshe Kelsang always talked about feeling. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has often talked about you need to generate a feeling, never explaining what that feeling exactly is. And it doesn't seem to be necessary because it's just that you're moved from within. So that is said to be extremely important for us later when you do the meditation. Well, I could say it later. I've talked about it now, never mind. But just, yes, so it shouldn't be like one ear in, the other out while you listen. So it was while listening, if there's some enthusiasm, it benefits you much more than just listening without much of that emotion. And of course, when you meditate, most importantly. All right. Now, before we go back to the text, sorry, today it's a little slow because I've been saying a few things. I have some questions, two, in fact. One is still from Jimmy. I just had it and I lost it. Just a sec. It's the second part of his question that he asked a few weeks ago. It's not directly connected to the subject, to emptiness as such. Well, indirectly it is, of course. For some reason I can't open it. Oh, yes, here it is. Okay. So he asked a question. He says, does the Tibetan Buddhist tradition have this kind of training, meditating on the sense fields? So paying close attention to the individual sense fields and examining what's happening there. So in other words, what you perceive with your eye consciousness, what you hear with your body conscious, with your ear consciousness, and so forth. So you have the 6 aspects of a visual sense fields: left, right, up, down, near, and far. And so, well, the purpose of the whole exercise is to be able to distinguish between the sense perception and mental perception. So the mental conceptual consciousness, which is such that when you perceive things, the external world, the sense objects, it's never, if you look at a table, for instance, you never perceive the table apart or separate from its environment. It's always within an environment that you perceive this table within. Whereas if you think about the table, if you apply your mental consciousness to take to mind the table, it appears totally isolated in this separate kind of way. Okay, so this is a Buddhist idea that is important for many reasons to understand the working of the mind in general and for other reasons. And so there's this meditation he also describes in here. Just to become aware, we always perceive a whole sense field and never just a part. Therefore, we conclude that any part of the multiple of a whole sense field is a mental fabrication. So if we just have a part of, if we just think of table, then that's a mental fabrication. That's actually the mind labeling table, because we have a concept of table, we have this generic image of table, and through this generic image, this mental representation of what table means to us, that appears to us totally isolated from, well, a certain background that it's usually found in, then thinking table, that's labeling table. That's the labeling mind. So that's not what he says, but I'm just adding that. So therefore, it makes sense to understand this. It makes perfect sense to do this kind of meditation. We always perceive a whole sense field, never a part. Partial sense field is a mental fabrication. So if I just think of a sense object like a table, well, it's a fabrication, yes. Therefore, common sense objects are mental fabrications. So I guess what he says is the objects we perceive in our mental consciousness. Philosopher George Berkeley uses a lot of this kind of meditation to arrive at the conclusion of mind only. He puts it into quotation marks, so mind only in the sense that it's a creation of the mind, not like mind only, school mind only, but as in the Buddhist idea of the mind being mainly responsible for the existence of phenomena. And so does the Theravada Buddhist tradition, I think, he says. So the question is, would possibly the sense field themselves be a mental fabrication? Well, from a Buddhist point of view, yes. Even the sense field, so in the sense, even what we perceive with our eye consciousness, does it exist exactly the way it appears to us? We perceive it? Well, no, modern science tells us that's not the case. That we had this discussion before. Colors appear in a certain way to us in which they actually don't exist. It's due to light waves hitting the retina and so forth that we perceive colors, which in that way, the way we perceive them, don't exist out there. So we can just take that, definitely that explanation, understanding the way we perceive this environment, it doesn't exist. So taking the scientific approach, or scientific understanding, and of course the Buddhist understanding too, as in like, well, what we perceive, just take the example of liquid that's perceived by humans as water, by preta beings as pus and blood, and so forth. Well, it shows that we were born with a human body that, due to its sense perception, so the karma we created being born with this body, with this sense perception, that then gives rise to a certain apprehension and perception of this world. So sense faculties, I should say, certain sense faculties that give rise, that cause our mind to perceive things in a certain way, which a being of another existence doesn't perceive. All right. So is there anything about this in Tibetan? Well, this kind of practice of just watching the sense field, I'm not aware that this exists, at least not in the Gelugpa tradition that I'm most familiar with. But in a way, I mean, this differentiating between the two, that's very much stressed, for instance, in the Pramanavartika text and the texts on logic and epistemology. So you could meditate. I mean, the point is we should meditate on whatever is taught in there. We shouldn't just academically study this and then, well, just gain knowledge, but rather do the meditations on that. And so the explanations are given in a slightly different way. Those meditations here are not prescribed, but there's no harm in doing them if that allows us to get a deeper understanding of the working of sense consciousnesses versus mental consciousnesses. So would I see any practical benefit? Yeah, surely. For some time. I mean, there are other meditations that are also extremely important, so we shouldn't spend that much time on them. But yeah, for our understanding, they're definitely helpful. And the last part of the question, I don't really understand. Would this be a practical way to cultivate special closeness to others by seeing their bodies being mental isolates of the same visual field as one's body? So the bodies of others being also just a mental fabrication, and so generating more closeness to others. Well, if I understand it correctly, well, any way to generate more closeness, if that works, the way we did it as part of the initial meditation of generating the motivation, I personally find that really effective, but just whatever you find effective, if I understood the last part correctly. Okay, so I hope I answered that to some degree. Then Tal also asked a question, but Tal's question I'll answer it anyway as part of what we're going to go through today. It's a very important question. I'm glad he asked it. So his question relates to meditation, that he finds it's a challenge every time he does the meditation on emptiness. He says, I can identify in my experience a sense of self that has some continuity and some distinctiveness, but not a sense of a self that is unchanging and independent. As a result, the conclusions of the analytical meditation seems to me trivial intellectually, but not very relevant to my experience. So trivial intellectually, I guess trivial as in like not really in any way meaningful, but not, and also at the same time not relevant to my experience. Obviously, these meditations have helped many practitioners transform their experience, and I would appreciate any suggestions on how I may be able to connect the analysis to my own. Perhaps I have some unconscious assumptions about myself being unchanging and independent that I could somehow bring into the consciousness or into conscious awareness, I guess he means. Okay, so I think that's a very important question, really important, and I'll address this. But before we return to the text, I still want to quickly say something about what I would like you to do for this week. So emotions are at the forefront again, generating bodhicitta. This time, I hope you're still doing this a few times a day, again and again. If you've neglected it, this is a good time to pick it up again. Continue with this practice every day. Generate bodhicitta, well, 10 times, 20 times, however many times that you can, at the very least early in the morning, just after you got up and before you fall asleep. And if you manage a few other times, great. And this time, bring in this kind of beginner's mind. Bring in this mind where you do it as if you did it for the first time. Every time you do it in a slightly different way, that it doesn't feel like you're just going through the motion, that it doesn't feel like just kind of having some kind of routine in doing it without feeling anything. So you should really be moved every time you generate it. But that's just one part. And of course, to continue on what I also mentioned last time, because you may find yourself, all sentient beings actually just includes certain sentient beings, maybe an abstract of sentient beings, all sentient beings, as if it was this, I don't know, some abstract entity, this substance called all sentient beings, or whichever way it appears to your mind. But of course, we're saying any living being, any possible living being in this universe, and that includes not just humans, not just animals, but even more than humans and more than animals, because there are these living beings, endless of them, that we just don't perceive. So to allow this possibility to include those two, and even if it's just thinking if they exist, so all these living beings that may be right here, right now in the room with me, which are certainly with me, all these living beings around me. I mean, I'm not talking about subtle insects and what have you, or like small insects that you just can't perceive. No, different forms of life. So a lot of us may think that's like talking about, I don't know, fairies and elves and goblins and gremlins, like just mythical kind of creatures. I'm not talking about those. I mean, those mythical creatures, who knows, maybe they have some basis in reality, and then they've been, as part of fairy tales and so forth, they've been slightly changed. The point is, there are definitely other forms of life, and to allow that possibility, I mean, just because I don't perceive it, it doesn't mean it's not there. And because most people we know haven't perceived it, doesn't mean it's not there. And we know that's true for so many other things. So therefore, again, to continue the sense of all sentient beings, in particular, understanding that they all have Buddha nature. We're surrounded by all these living beings. And again, as part of this practice, initially, well, drawing them closer to us, understanding that their existence is important for my own well-being, even if it's just indirectly, just through the connection of all sentient beings. Well, it's less obvious, of course, with beings from other realms. Here we may just take humans or animals of this planet. Of course, if we can widen this on other planets, I mean, they may not benefit us in any way directly, or even difficult to say in which way they could benefit us indirectly, but just to include them as well, to get a sense of these a huge amount of sentient beings, and then understanding that they have Buddha nature, they have the potential to attain the state of a Buddha, become just like a Buddha, and generate more of a sense of equanimity. Okay, and then we'll continue with the same kind of practice. We'll continue next week with a little bit more, but focus on this, focus on that, and allow that possibility, at least consider the possibility of other realms of existence, if you have a hard time with that. And if not, just do the practice the way I just said, in terms of generating a sense all sentient beings have the potential to become fully enlightened. All right, that's enough as preparatory material before we start with the text, or it's enough for what you should do this coming week. And then let's go back to the text. Oh, yes. So since this is so important, just briefly, verse 120, that's when we started. That was the verse we started with to describe selflessness. Okay, so I just want to quickly just mention this verse again. It's usually cited as the verse of selflessness. If you talk about this topic, like refuting itself, then if His Holiness mentions this particular topic, usually he quotes this verse, 120. So the first 3 lines, what do they tell us? The first 2 lines really tell us how we get from self-grasping to suffering. Not in this extensive way, but it's included in that. So what do yogis see, those who've understood this? So someone like the Buddha with his wisdom, seeing that all afflictions, all afflictive emotions, all harmful emotions such as aversion, anger, and so forth, well, they give rise to all the other folds, such as the different forms of suffering. They give rise to first karmic actions, and then those in turn result in birth, aging, sickness, and death, and all the other problems. And then all these afflictions and the folds that they give rise to, they originate, or they stem from the identity view, the self-grasping, that grasps at the perishable collection. Okay, so it's self-grasping. Actually, self-grasping, and I said that before, is of 2 types: grasping at our own self and grasping at the self of others. So grasping at our own self is called the view grasping at the perishable collection. And of course, it's obvious that we're much more preoccupied with ourselves and therefore have a lot more self-grasping than we have grasping at other people. We grasp indirectly at others when we believe others bring us happiness, or when we want to be away from them, we perceive an inherent I in another person. Of course, we have that as well, but usually self-grasping is definitely stronger, or is definitely more frequent, I should say. Okay, so therefore, what is the sequence that is presented in this verse here? Well, first you have self-grasping. Here, self-grasping at your own self, and that gives rise to attachment to the I, a sense that the I is more precious. We had this question before: how come? And I asked you to answer it last time. I think, well, we could let it be now. So why does it get that? Why does that self-grasping give rise to attachment to the I, which is stronger than attachment to mine? Well, is that really true or not? And I would say, it's just an opinion I have, but personally, I would say it is stronger in terms of the I, because the I is that which is in charge of that which is mine. So it's seen as the main entity that is responsible for that which is mine. The sense that there's this intrinsic entity, there's some entity here that's not the mind, that's not the body, but that owns mind and body. And therefore, that's the main aspect, and it owns them. In fact, you've heard this from Yangde Rinpoche if you were there. The Tibetan word for I is da. No, the Tibetan word for self. There's a word I, that's nga. And then there is the Tibetan word for self, that's da. Da is the same, the word da is the same word as the word dakpo. Dakpo means owner. Okay, so really the word I, the word self, has the meaning of being an owner. Therefore, the I is often described as that which is the owner of mind and body. I mean, if there were an inherently existent I, it would be the owner of mind and body. That's how it appears to the mind. Or the utilizer, that which utilizes mind and body, that which controls mind and body. All right. So in that way, that which is being controlled in the controller, if there's a sense there's this controller there. I mean, this is just a projection by our own mind. But nonetheless, based on that projection, there's a sense this is really important. and that which is mine is kind of only secondary. But then, of course, of that which is mine, there's certain things that are more important than others. My life is seen as more important than my possessions. Not for everyone, but usually when it comes down to save your possessions or save your own life, well, usually we save our own life, because in the end, that is associated with the I. So whether they're equally important in that moment, but they guarantee the continuity of the I, our life. So we hold on to that very strongly. But in a sense, I would say, like I said just now, that the I is kind of that which owns mind, body, etc. So in that sense, I would say that is the reason why there's the strongest attachments towards the I, but also towards that which the mind wants. The mind is attached to the I. Why to the I? Because, well, not to other beings, because the mind associates labels I based on mind and body. And after having labeled, then because of the habituation with a sense of inherent existence, the mind then believes that merely labeled I, which is closer to this, in the case of my own mind, it labels I on the basis of this mind and this body. And since this merely labeled I is closest to my mind, I perceive this I as more precious than anyone else's I or anyone else's self. And then based on that, there's, of course, what does my mind want? It wants happiness. It likes happy experiences and it doesn't like unhappy experiences. It's just the nature of the mind. It wants to be happy and it doesn't want to suffer. Even if there was no self-grasping, there would be just that natural drive to be happy and satisfied. However, because of that misapprehension of the I and that which is mine, that exaggerated sense of I and mine, there's therefore the sense there's truly existent happiness, and that's my happiness that is more important. And then based on that, anything that brings me this happiness, attachment arises, aversion towards that which doesn't bring me that happiness, and so forth, giving rise to all the other afflictive emotions, and in the end, suffering. So we know all this. So that's described indirectly by these words here. Seeing with their wisdom that all afflictions and all faults come from the perishable collection. And what is the object of that view, grasping at the perishable collection? An inherent I, knowing that self. That is the focus of this identity view. So what is the focus? What is the object of this? Well, it's an inherently existent self. And that's what we're trying to understand. So that describes basically the first two truth of suffering and the causes of suffering. And the yogi engages in the negation of selfhood. So it talks about the path. The path is negating that selfhood, and implied, of course, the cessation, therefore, then of suffering through the negation of its causes. So in a way, I would say the Four Noble Truths are included in that verse, although I haven't seen that in any commentary. Okay, now, having explained that first verse again, what were we left with? We hear the yogi negates that merely fabricated I. How do we negate it? And here, the way it's being negated is by searching for it. What else are you going to do? If you perceive an I, well, let's search for it. If there really was such an I, and oftentimes lack of inherent existence is described as the non-findability of the I. And for that, we have to look for it. There's just no way around it. So I've said this today on a different occasion, but I'm just, saying it here again, that with emptiness, people like emptiness. In the West, we particularly like emptiness. And we like to hear new ideas over and over again. And sometimes we do get them, where we get new understandings, like people say things that we haven't heard before. But sometimes there's almost a craving, like I want to hear something that I haven't heard before, and a resistance towards hearing the same thing. But of course, there's a limit to how much you can say about emptiness. Or, no limit on the other hand, but whether you understand it or not is a different matter. So what's really important, I believe, is that whatever we learn, we need to apply it. in the end, Buddhism is a system where the scriptures are only secondary. As in, of course, you learn the scriptures, they are important at the beginning, but none of the scriptures can prove to you emptiness. Only your own mind can prove to you emptiness. Only your own mind can establish the lack of inherent existence. So taking those reasonings that are given in the scriptures and making them your own, really understanding those reasonings, and based on them, inferring the lack of inherent existence. So that's a job only us can do. There's no way just reading the text, hearing a lot of people talk, that one day you understand it based on that. No way. Just no way. Forget about it. So to receive lots and lots and lots of teachings, read all sorts of books and never applying it, I don't know. I mean, if that's your sense of fun, oh yeah, all right. I mean, I'm not saying that's not a good idea, but hoping that just based on that you realize emptiness, no, not all the causes and conditions have come together. At least you need to meditate on the I. And of course, you need these other three aspects that I talked about. Do not neglect those. And there are loads of stories, not just the ancient stories, but even the modern day meditators who talk about having obstacles and not being able to progress in their practice, in particular when it comes to, well, wisdom, understanding of emptiness. And again, they leave aside this and they focus on accumulating merit, purifying negativities, and supplicating the Lama. Very important part of Buddhist practice. It should not be neglected. And oftentimes I meet Westerners. In the West, we like to pick and choose our own practices, and that's fine. I mean, everyone should do this, and Tibetans do that too, of course. But we're a bit like, oh, I'm a free person. I just like bodhicitta. I'll leave the rest. Or like only emptiness. I only do that. I only do supplication to the Lama. I only do kind of guru devotion. I only practice that. The rest I don't like. Sure, fair enough if that makes you happy, but don't expect to gain the fullest result of these teachings, because we need all of them. Okay, just to stress this again, but to return to the subject matter. So therefore, what we need to do is now spend some time. What is this I? What is this sense of an I? The I that gets up in the morning, the I that brushes its teeth, that's having breakfast, that's having coffee, that's doing this and that, that's driving a car, that's in the traffic jam, that goes to work. Again and again, spend time on that. Not just the I that's sitting there to meditate. I mean, that's not enough. There's so much more to us, to the self. How does it exist? In particular, in relation to mind and body. It can only be one with the aggregates or separate from the aggregates. There is no other possibility, and I gave you the reason for why. It's either totally separate from the aggregates, or it's one with the aggregates. Because if it existed the way it appears to us as this inherent entity, it would exist independently. So it couldn't be kind of inseparably linked to the aggregates. That would be impossible. It would have to exist independently. But this takes me to Tal's question. So he asked a really important question. Actually, when it comes to independent, does the I exist independently of mind and body? Of course, we know the answer. No, it doesn't. Do we perceive the I to exist totally independently of mind and body? Well, innately, actually, we don't. This is where it's a little bit complicated. Innately, there's actually no sense. So we're born with a mistaken sense of an I. We're born with that. And that born sense does not convey or does not suggest that the I exists independently of mind and body. Actually, it doesn't. Because we have an innate sense that the I is connected to mind and body. We do have that sense. So although separate, sometimes there's a sense it's separate from mind and body, but still connected. Okay, so where does this whole thing come from? Where does this notion come from? There's no independent I, as if that was the way we perceive the I. No, this needs to be understood. The innate I is perceived as something inherent, inherent. What does that mean? There is something within mind and body, inside it, naturally within mind and body, that is called the I. That is neither mind nor body. That is in and of itself the I. That not just labeling, not because we labeled it. No, if there was nothing else in the whole world, not even the labeling mind, there would still be this I. This sense there's something there. And that you could find that you could find that I. That is the sense we have. That's the sense of inherent existence. And if that existed, if inherent existence were to exist, the I would exist independently. It would follow from that. It wouldn't need anything. If nothing else existed and it could still exist, well, it would exist independently, obviously. But inherent existence is when you perceive inherent existence, you don't necessarily perceive independent existence, because this innate sense of inherent existence doesn't include that. So that's important. Now, Tal had this question. He says, I don't innately have that sense of being independent. No, innately you don't. You don't. Okay, that's just the consequence. That's just what would follow if the self existed in that way. That's why we use dependent arising to understand that it's merely labeled. It's the deepest level of dependence that we look at here. We may have a sense, the I is dependent on causes and conditions, it's dependent on its parts, but really, to really understand that this I, if it existed inherently, it could not be just labeled. Well, for that, we use the dependent arising on that deeper level. All right. So this was hopefully clearer that innately we have no sense of an independent I. Okay. One part I wanted to mention. But still, based on that innate sense of an I, we have an intellectually constructed idea of an I. So intellectually, I mean, people have different thoughts and different ideas, and well, I don't know what different people are thinking, but I'm sure there are certain individuals who have a sense, what is the I? And they come up with their own ideas, and that may actually lead them to an intellectually acquired sense of a self that includes some independent entities. Allows for an independent entity. That's an intellectually acquired self-grasping mind. But that's just on an individual basis. And then you have whole systems that, of course, an individual person maybe came up with, but that a lot of people accept. So an independent soul, or in the Indian system, the idea of, well, a certain I that's partless, permanent, and independent. So they came up with this idea. Now, Tal, of course, you don't have this. This perception of an I innately. You don't. If you follow the system, you may have developed it, but you don't have it innately. What are you lacking? The sense of an innate sense of an independent I. You don't have that. But let's look at permanence. We have to look at permanence again, because we have a sense that the I is permanent and impermanent both. Okay? And if we perceive it both, which of course is contradictory, but we're very good with contradictions. Our mind lives with contradictions, so no surprise there. Now, with regard to the sense we are dependent and independent, we are permanent and impermanent both. You have a sense of your I being a continuity and definitely a sense of change. So, of course, if you look back when you were 5 years old, when you were 8 years old, when you were 15 years old, obviously there's some change. So in that sense, looking back further in the past and comparing it to who we are now, definitely a sense we're changing. But that is only coarse impermanence. That's only coarse impermanence. So when I say we hold on to a permanent I, that is much more a subtle permanence, in the sense that when you take shorter time spans, so I today and I yesterday, or I don't know, last year and I now, then it's harder to see those changes. Moreover, so, or just take like yesterday and today. I'm just the same person. Okay, I'm still the same person. That is one way in which we don't necessarily realize that even yesterday and today's I, they have changed. I mean, there's been change from yesterday until today. And not just that. Also, what we also do is there's a sense I'm just still that I was when I was 30 years old, for instance, right? The sense like sometimes we may catch ourselves, oh, I'm still that same person. If, for instance, we're still hurting because of something that happened to us when we were, I don't know, 30 or 15 or whenever, the sense I'm still that I. All right. So again, there's this, that's contradictory, thinking I'm still that person. I'm still hurting from the hurt that I received then. So it's like, why am I still hurt? When someone did something to me when I was 15 or 30 or whenever, I'm not that same person anymore. So why would I be, why would I still hold on to it? You see, there's still the sense that there's still the same person. I sometimes use the example of another person. If you're holding a grudge, that is, if someone does something to you yesterday, did something to you yesterday, and you're still angry with that person today, because your mind has this sense like it conveys to you, or the mind apprehends this person today to be the person who harmed you yesterday. If this person today is the person who harmed you yesterday, that means there's no difference between yesterday's and today's person. They're the same, which means the person is permanent. By implication, that means they're permanent. So therefore, we kind of have both. We have a sense, the I, like I said before, the I that sat down for this class is the same as the I that sat down for this class an hour ago, is the same now. It's the same I now, for instance. And again, that would mean it's permanent. So you need to look a little closer if you have a general sense at certain times of the day that there is a continuation that's changing. That is not the only mind you should take as the principal mind that you want to focus on. Yeah, in that moment, you have a correct sense of the I, possibly. But at other times, there's a sense, I'm still hurting. I'm still the same person. This guy is the one that harmed me. He's the guy who harmed me yesterday. That's the same guy. I can't stand that person, for instance. So a sense that yesterday's I and today's I are the same. This person who harmed me yesterday and the guy today, same person. If they're the same, they haven't changed. Okay, so in that way, to dig a little bit deeper, to recognize your own sense, and I'm pretty sure you'll find it, your own sense of it's the same. If you just look at the sky, oh, it's the same sun. If you come to a place that you visited earlier, like, I don't know, if you went to a certain place in Israel that you thought was really beautiful, like 5 years ago, and you come back to this place and you'd say, oh, it's still there, the same beach. So there's really like the mind seems to suggest it's still the same. There's an innate sense of like, it's still the same. And of course, this applies to the I. So there is definitely, for us, we definitely have a sense the I is unchanging at certain times. So please look at this again. And again, with regard to this independence that I just mentioned, well, if the I existed as this separate entity able to define itself and what have you, it would follow it exists independently. Now, why are we talking about this non-Buddhist system? Not so much because we believe that the I is permanent, part is independent. No. But just to look at the different possibilities of how an I could exist in general and how it can be misperceived, to kind of compare, to kind of be honest with ourselves. Is there any aspect here that I might recognize? May I find myself within this view in some way? That's one part. But of course, also because they have a whole philosophical system on a totally separate I. And although we don't believe in an independent I, we do believe in an I that is somehow separate from mind and body. Okay? And to understand that misapprehension better, we look at this extreme view of this non-Buddhist school. Okay. having said that, then the next verses, and I don't need to repeat them really, but verse 121, it just briefly describes the Samkhya and the Vaisheshika view. I purposely didn't give you the view of the Samkhya and the Vaisheshika because I won't be able to explain you anything further than that's what's in the text. So you could just read it on your own. But to summarize the two views, they describe a permanent, partless, independent self. I mean, if it's impermanent, sorry, if it is, why partless? Partless just because if it exists independent of mind and body, well, which parts would it have? It couldn't have mind, it couldn't have body because it exists independent of them. If it has them, that means there's an ownership, and ownership implies dependence. But if it exists independent of mind and body, it doesn't own mind and body, and it would have to be partless. Which parts would it have? All right, so that's verse 121, describing that kind of permanent, partless, independent self. Usually that's how it's described. Of course, there's slight differences, but in meaning, that's what's referred to. And then 122, it's saying that that doesn't exist, that such an I is not possible. Let me look at my own text here, 121, 122. Yeah, so like a barren woman's child, it's like, it's actually, why does it say a barren woman's child? Why does it not say like the horns of a rabbit? Well, in the sense, like, just as the child of a woman who can't have children, the self of the child of a woman who can't have children doesn't exist. Likewise, this I doesn't exist. So whether you talk about the self of the child that was born from a woman who can't have children, well, that is just as that can't exist. This I that is permanent, partless, is devoid of being born. Here it says devoid of arising. What's his name? He uses the word arising, but you can also say it's devoid of being born. Just as this child is not born, this I is not born. And being born and arising is the same word in Tibetan. Arising, being generated, being born. Okay, so such a simply does not exist, impossible. It also cannot be the basis for grasping at an I. So when you grasp at an I, there's a focal object. I spoke about this last time. There's an existent, a conventional I, and that is then apprehended in a way in which it cannot exist. So that has to be, so the basis for grasping at the I has to be the existing I, not the I asserted by these non-Buddhists. So therefore it cannot be claimed to exist even on a conventional level. I mean, you can't say it doesn't exist conventionally. All right. Okay. And then in verse 123, it basically says the same thing. So that this has not arisen, that their idea of being unarisen, of being not, of being permanent, which they accept, well, that's impossible to have such a self. And none of these attributes that the non-Buddhists give to this self is possible. So therefore, there's no self. So to say in general, no self separate from the aggregates. There's no apprehension of self. So now to do the meditation, how would you meditate on that? You're not really looking at your own mind that is mistaken with regard to the self that perceives a permanent, partless, independent self, because, well, you probably don't have such a sense of an I. But having understood the way it is described here, there's still a sense of it being separate. Maybe not in that extreme way, but still separate. So moving away from moving away from the way it is described by this non-Buddhist school in general, I personally have a sense there's a separate I. There's something separate there. Something that is the owner of mind and body, that utilizes mind and body, that controls mind and body. Just something separate. But then if it existed separate, what does separate mean? And now you need to really go through this. If it existed separately, what does that mean in my daily life? If someone bumps into me, how can I say they bumped into me if they bumped into my body? There's a sense the I pervades the body and the mind, and it's still separate. In what way does it pervade it while being separate? We never give it much thought. There's a sense of like, oh yeah, it pervades it and it's separate. Okay, good enough. We have an answer, and we never take it further. we're just satisfied with that. But what does that mean? What does that mean? If someone hurts my feelings, why do they hurt me? Right? If they hurt my feeling, in what way do they hurt me? Okay, if someone insults me, so physical harm, verbal harm, whatever it is. Well, insult, for instance, well, verbal harm can mean both. My body is hurt, is harmed, is hurt, and my feelings are hurt as well. But the question that arises, in what way do I feel I've been hurt? How have I been hurt? And what's so interesting, this idea, don't take it personally. We've all heard that phrase, right? If someone does something, they bump into us and we get really angry, or they act in a certain way that really makes us angry. Another person tells us, don't take it personally. Right away, what does that mean for us? It means this other person, I believe what it means is difficult to really define it, but I believe it means don't think the other person intended to harm you personally. They just did it because they had a bad mood. They were in a bad mood and they just lashed out. So it's worse. It's worse if they wanted to harm me, right? If they just found my body unattractive and therefore wanted to, I don't know, hit me or something, I still be hurt because I see that connection. But if they just had no intention of harming me or mine, then I don't take it personally. I don't take it personally. It's not as bad. It's interesting how this idea, I take it personally. This was directed at me. And what is this I? What is this I? Even if my feeling, just the idea, my feeling was hurt. How is my feeling hurt? And my body, if you think about your body, what does it make it your body? What is it that makes it your body? Really, if you think about it, scientifically, if you take modern science, if I take my own body, modern science has proven that the cells of my body, so part of the body cells that are part of my body, that are actually my body cells, are outnumbered by the cells of other living entities that live in my body, like trillions of bacteria. Their body cells actually outnumber my own. So really, the body cells in my body, the cells of my body are a lot less that are really my body as such. They're connected to my mind. They are outnumbered by all these bacteria that live in my body. So I just looked it up online, and yes, we have more cells in our body, live more cells of organisms that are not strictly speaking part of our body. So it still is my body. It's actually their body. It belongs to those bacteria. Come on, it's not my body. What does it make? What makes it my body? It's theirs, really. So really to analyze, to check in what way was I hurt when someone, I don't know, bumps into my shoulder, for instance. To really reflect on that. In what way was I? If it happens to another person, couldn't care less. If it happens to me, whoa, it's bad. Okay, that's one thing to reflect on. And then further, if I get insulted, if it's not a physical kind of physical harm that is inflicted on me, but mental harm, I say my feelings was, what feeling was hurt? If you say my feeling was hurt, oh, your feeling was hurt, what does that mean? Is it like the feeling is not as strong as it was? It's hurt now? Oh, that's probably not what it means. Well, usually what people say is like my feeling of happiness was turned into a feeling of suffering. So my feeling really wasn't hurt. It's like my good feeling was replaced by a bad feeling. That's really what happened, right? Okay, if that happens, my feeling was hurt in that way. In what way was my I hurt? Okay, so this question we have to ask. So I just see that time is up already. Yes, exactly. But I felt, just going over this again, I don't want it to just be those words. We've heard them over and over. They're not really difficult to understand, but to bring them onto this experiential level, to bring this into your daily life. All day long, we're thinking, I. I mean, it's never far away. It's never far away. We think about it all the time, but we never have the space of mind, or hardly ever have the space of mind to reflect, what is that I that thinks this, that, and the other, that is hurt, that is pleased, and so forth. Okay, but just to conclude this part, so there is no self separate from the aggregates because there's no apprehension of self apart from the aggregates. Well, okay, so there's no separate I because totally separate is not possible, because otherwise you can only say I see the self if I perceive a part of the aggregates. But how do the two connect? That's still the question. And then it says in 124, it is also unacceptable to be the basis for being's I clinging, for the identity views present, even those unaware of such self. Now, you had a similar sentence before in verse 122, when it said that the I can also not be the basis for grasping at an I. That meant, previously it meant that the permanent I, the permanent partners independent I, as asserted by the non-Buddhists, okay, that I is not the focal object of the innate self-grasping, because the focal object, that which the mind focuses on, has to be the existent I. That's what it says previously in 122. But here saying it is also unacceptable to be the basis for being's I clinging is not saying that the I here, the permanent partners independent I, it's not saying it's not the focal object. It's saying it's not the object of that mind per se. It's not the apprehended object, if you like. So in other words, your innate self-clinging mind, self-grasping mind, is not a mind that clings at a permanent partner's independent self based on the conventional self. No, because that permanent partner's independent self, that is not apprehended innately, as I said earlier on. So therefore, here, previously in verse 122, the author said, Chandrakirti said that the permanent partner's independent self is not the focal object of clinging at the I. And here it's saying that the permanent partner's independent self is not the apprehended object, the main object, that which the mind clings at. It's not that. Okay, so there's no repetition here. He's not really saying the same thing again, although it looks like it from the words, but he's just looking at this self, like how do we perceive it and what is the basis for our self-clinging. And so saying here that our innate mind doesn't perceive a permanent partner's independent self, the reason it's giving because for the identity view is present even in those unaware of such a self. So those who are not familiar with this philosophical view of a permanent partner's independent self. And those, it says in 125, those who spend many eons in the animal realm and so on, do not perceive this unborn permanent entity, this permanent partner's independent self. Yet one sees that I clinging operates in those beings as well. There's thus no self that is separate from the aggregates, the way they perceive it, the way these non-Buddhist philosophers perceive it. But of course, we as humans, as ordinary beings who have not studied this, and innately, we may still have a sense of at least a separate I, connected to your mind and body, but still separate. All right, so the text explicitly talks about this totally separate this totally separate permanent partners independent I, but implied in that is, of course, that even the sense of a separate I, the way we perceive it, is impossible. All right, so before we then continue next week with verse 126, with now analyzing the other option that the self is the same as the aggregates and denying that, before we do that, well, I went through this particular part again. I thought it was too important to just race through it. So to enable you also, of course, to do the meditation, and we'll do that together now. Okay. So what I basically talked about now, let's now go deeper to the more experiencing level and reflect on that. And again, try to bring an emotion in. don't just go through it without allowing this to affect your own mind. In particular, towards the end, when I ask you to focus single-pointedly on whatever insight or whatever conclusion you've come to. But as always, we start with some breathing meditation just to focus the mind. So let's start this analysis by first becoming aware of your own innate sense of a separate I. Of the object of your mind thinking I, which seems to, although not independent of mind and body, but still be separate from the mental and physical aggregate. It appears to the mind as if it was the controller of mind and body, or their owner. That which utilizes the mind and the body. Try to see whether that is true in your own case. An I that needs to be protected. Protected from harm. That is more important than others. that at times seems so strong that it gives rise to the sense that it's located in the head or in the heart, maybe even in the belly. Definitely always somewhere around our body or within our body. Sorry. But then how is it connected to mind and body? How can it be the owner of our toes? How come if they step on my feet, I was hurt? Since the eye seems to be more located towards the center of our body, and less so in the excrements, like the toes and so forth. In what way does hurting my arm or my toes also hurt me? My body, my mind experiences pain. But in what way does the eye experience pain? And even if there is no pain and someone still bumps into us, in what way did this person bump into me, into the eye? And then considering insult. If someone says something hurtful, how does it hurt my eye? Do these words lessen my I or decrease my I? If someone unjustly tells me I'm lazy and I'm not, do these words make my I lazy? If someone calls me a friar or a sucker, does that make my I being a sucker? Does it turn myself into a sucker? So it's obvious that when we reflect on it, we can come to understand that it's very difficult to explain how the I can be harmed physically or verbally. Simply because the I, the way it is perceived by our own mind, doesn't exist. Since there is no separate entity, that pervades mind and body, that's the owner, the psychophysical complex. And therefore certainly no I that is more important than others. Our self-centeredness is based on a projection, on a non-existent self. Holding something to be superior that does not at all exist. For otherwise, we will be able to find it. And now, to complete this analytical meditation, spend a few moments just focusing on the insight or the conclusion that you've reached as a result of this analysis. Whatever feeling that has arisen, focus on that feeling, on that conclusion. And allow for it to sink deeper into your mind. And then, of course, let's dedicate whatever virtue, whatever positive potential we've accumulated towards, of course, the long life of our lamas, the spiritual teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and so forth. May they live extremely long and continue to share their insights. And may, of course, in the long term, this become the cause that we attain the enlightened state of a Buddha. Remove all the obstructions in our mind for the welfare of all sentient beings. But also right here and right now, benefit those around us. Like Tali Lubin and everyone else who's sick of body, but also sick of mind. May reduce the current suffering of climate change everywhere in the world. And of course, in the way described by Shantideva in his prayer. Can we have Shantideva's prayer? Okay, thank you. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food, may the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain. Until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And just to remind you of your homework, your work for this week, bodhicitta again, with more feeling, if you like, with more intensity than before, together with more of an emotional state of mind, like a beginner's mind. So if you think along those lines, and of course, reflect on other ways of life, other states of existence, to just allow that possibility and become aware all of those living beings, all of those sentient beings are just like ourselves, just want to become happy, want to be happy, not to suffer, and they all have the potential to become a Buddha. Just to remind ourselves again of that. All right, then there's not more to say except have a good week, be safe, and see you again
Thank you,
next
Geshe-ma.
Sunday.
Thank you, Geshe-ma.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Geshe-ma.
Bye.
Dankeschön. Gute Nacht. Thank you, Dharma friends.
Thank you. Thank you all.